Hello, everyone. Welcome back, friends, to my channel, Creepy Shadow Stories. In today's episode, I'll be sharing true and unsettling stories about the Appalachian Mountains. If you thought the mountains were a peaceful place, you might want to think again. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and share it with your friends. Let me know where you're watching from. Thank you all. Now, let's get started. Story 1. I was merely 8 years old when I inadvertently wandered away from Uncle Hal during one of our customary nocturnal excursions into the woodlands directly behind his secluded cabin, nestled high within the hills adjacent to Bowers Hollow. Each July, my entire family would meticulously load up our antiquated van and embark on the lengthy journey from Nashville, Tennessee, to spend approximately 1 to 2 weeks with Uncle Hal amidst the towering mountains. This annual pilgrimage had become an ingrained family tradition. My father and Hal were indeed siblings, yet their appearances offered no such indication. My father maintained a clean-shaven countenance, wore eyeglasses, and held a conventional office occupation. In stark contrast, Hal appeared as though he had stepped directly from a lumberjack syndicate crew. He possessed massive, powerful hands, a beard that descended to his collarbone, intricate tattoos adorning his arms, and a perpetual subtle scent of gasoline and cedar. He resided in solitude, a fact we collectively perceived as the epitome of coolness. His rustic cabin was situated precisely at the forest's periphery, an ancient, low-slung log dwelling that gave the impression of having organically emerged from the very hillside itself. Beyond it stretched nothing but an unbroken expanse of forest, seemingly miles upon miles of densely packed pine trees, suffused with a mossy, profound silence. Even as a mere child, I could discern that this silence was not simply an absence of sound. It felt like a tangible presence. The trees did not merely stand there. They appeared to observe. They seemed to breathe. As night descended, the atmosphere became particularly peculiar. It wasn't loud with the typical sounds of crickets and owls and other nocturnal creatures. Instead, it was quiet, so utterly quiet it caused one's ears to ache, and despite the fact that none of us ever vocalized it, we all intuitively sensed it. There was something inherently unsettling about those woods. Nevertheless, Hal possessed a unique aptitude for instilling a sense of security. He kept us continually engaged, constructing rudimentary slingshots, arranging tin cans for target practice, and welding discarded metal fragments into bizarre, diminutive sculptures. One particular year, he assisted me in fashioning a small lizard from a collection of spoons. We would also ignite various objects in a designated fire pit for no other discernible purpose than to observe them melt. He embodied the spirit of a colossal child, equipped with tools and an abundance of questionable concepts. Still, the most cherished aspect, the event we eagerly anticipated every single summer, was the switchback hunt. It was a peculiar game he had either conceived himself or, depending on his current disposition, asserted that he had not invented. According to Hal, the switchbacks were enigmatic creatures, part crow and part squirrel, possessing claws as slender and sharp as sewing needles and an inexplicable penchant for objects that shimmered. They purportedly established their nests within dense, thorny thickets far beyond the established trails, and emerged exclusively at night to pilfer from unsuspecting campers. However, they did not covet provisions. They desired items that sparkled, buttons, keys, coins, and watches. And should one inadvertently leave out something of significant value, they would purportedly exchange it for something decidedly strange. A deceased bird, a stone meticulously shaped like a human tooth, or on one occasion, Hal solemnly claimed a perfectly folded napkin thoroughly saturated in pine resin. We never genuinely put our faith in his tales, but we harbored a fervent desire to believe. Annually, Hal would designate one specific night and declare that the time had arrived. He would distribute musty, antiquated burlap sacks that reeked faintly of onions and mildew, and pass around flashlights that barely retained a charge. And so, we would set off. My brother, our two cousins, and I, trailing behind Hal with an intricate blend of exhilaration and a subtle undercurrent of apprehension. That particular year, I believe it was 2006, Hal presented something novel. He asserted that he had discovered fresh switchback prints just beyond the final fork in the trail. He beckoned us over to the edge of the tree line and indicated some scuffed leaves and distinct claw marks imprinted in the soft dirt. Although I personally discerned nothing unusual, I dutifully nodded in feigned comprehension. He then leaned in remarkably close and whispered that whatever entity had left those impressions was significantly bigger than usual. Subsequently, he smiled in his characteristic wide, mischievous manner. Yet there was an unsettling quality in his gaze that caused my stomach to knot slightly. We commenced our journey just as dusk was settling. The air was warm and oppressively humid, the kind of stickiness that causes one's shirt to adhere uncomfortably to the back. The flashlights were already beginning to dim, casting more elongated shadows than useful illumination. And the deeper we ventured, the more profound the silence became. Every sound was amplified, each careful footstep, every brittle twig snapping beneath our weight, every single breath. The narrow trail meandered, winding through constricted gullies and small, sunken hollows where the trees grew so densely that the sky above utterly disappeared from view. I deliberately remained near the rear of the group, meticulously scanning the dense woods as if I might genuinely discern something out of place. We all harbored the desire to be the first to spot it. Then a distinct whistle pierced the air, sharp, thin, and too high-pitched to originate from any of us. It sliced through the dense trees with a discernible purpose. Hal's head abruptly snapped upwards. He raised a cautionary hand, then swiftly headed in the direction of the sound. The others eagerly ran after him, their voices echoing with shouts and laughter. I attempted to maintain their pace, but my foot ensnared on a protruding root, and I went tumbling down the gentle slope, veering off the main trail. It wasn't a great distance, perhaps only 10 feet. But when I managed to sit upright, they had simply vanished, completely gone. It was as if the expansive forest had literally consumed them whole. There were no longer any voices, no crunching leaves, just an absolute stillness. I did not shout. I probably should have, I suppose, but something about the overwhelming quietude instilled in me a sense that I was not permitted to generate any noise, as if any sound would inevitably attract something I profoundly wished not to encounter. So I remained seated there, half interred in a tangled mass of leaves and ferns, clutching my dim flashlight like a desperate weapon. I silently instructed myself to stand up. I did not. Then just ahead of me, something stirred. I perceived its amorphous shape before my mind could fully comprehend it. My initial thought was that it was a dog, large, perhaps a stray, but everything about its form was fundamentally incorrect. The manner in which it stood was simultaneously too low and too high. Its legs flexed in an unnatural manner, resembling those of a grasshopper, and its back was hunched into a bizarre, uneven slope. Its skin appeared raw, stretched tautly like leather that had been left exposed to the sun for an excessive duration. Patches of coarse black hair sprouted erratically along its neck and spine. Its head twitched, tilted slightly, and then its gaze fixed upon me. Its eyes did not blink. They simply stared as if awaiting some unspoken command. Its mouth repeatedly opened and closed, yet no sound whatsoever emerged. There was only a profound shudder, as if it was struggling to articulate and had forgotten the very mechanics of speech. Then finally it emitted a sound. Not a growl, not even remotely similar. It was a soft, rattling moan, akin to wind blowing through an empty bottle, yet deeper, more hollow and disturbingly human. It advanced a single step forward. I ceased breathing. I literally could not. My entire physical being locked into a state of paralysis. Then from directly behind me, branches snapped, heavily, slowly. For a fleeting moment, I suspected there was more than one. "Jace!" Hal's voice resonated, sharp and ragged. He barreled through the dense underbrush, seized me firmly by the arm, and forcibly yanked me upright. He did not reprimand me, as was his usual custom. Instead, he simply gazed at me as if he genuinely believed I had vanished. His face was notably pale beneath his thick beard. "You cannot simply vanish like that," he uttered, his voice low, almost trembling. I recounted to him the unsettling sight I had just witnessed. He did not immediately respond. He merely looked back toward the dark trees. Then at last he stated that it was probably a fox with mange or shadows playing tricks. "But you saw something," I insisted. He regarded me with a tight, sorrowful expression, as if he was reluctant to lie but knew no alternative. "The woods mess with your head at dusk," he concluded. "Best not to chase ghosts." That proved to be our final switchback hunt. Story 2. I was 27 years old when I began volunteering with the Forest Path team, operating near the northernmost expanse of the Cerulean Mountain Passage. My full-time employment was at Horizon Auto Works in Cedarton, where I routinely handled exhaust system repairs, brake jobs, and alignment checks. By the time Friday arrived, I typically found myself too wired to properly unwind and yet too physically drained to undertake anything truly meaningful. I had ceased drinking the preceding year, and the silence in my life had begun to stretch for durations longer than I was accustomed to. I suppose I simply craved something to occupy my hands. The Green Canopy Preservation Society, which I joined, was quite small. It comprised local residents, avid hikers, and a couple of elderly gentlemen who had likely been engaged in trail work since the early 1980s. The sort of individuals who still relied on traditional paper maps and evinced little concern for modern GPS applications. Our responsibilities primarily involved routine trail maintenance, nothing excessively strenuous, clearing fallen branches, reinforcing footpaths, and installing fresh signage following storms. The types of tasks that keep trails traversable but largely go unacknowledged. What I appreciated most were the assignments that led one off the conventional, well-trodden routes. Many of those subsidiary trails barely existed anymore, appearing as faint fire roads, forgotten offshoots, or ancient paths from before the state park system assumed control. These were not the sorts of places frequented by tourists, which suited me perfectly fine. I cherished the profound quietude. On that particular Saturday, I received one of those coveted assignments. A solo flagging expedition up a seldom-used fire road situated on the north-facing slope of a ridge designated as Malden Crest. They provided me with a weathered topographic map adorned with hand-drawn annotations, in addition to a pristine roll of bright orange flagging tape. The objective was straightforward: follow the trail as far as it extended, mark any areas requiring clearing or attention, and meticulously record coordinates for significant hazards such as washouts or fallen trees. They informed me that no one had ascended that path in quite some time. That inherent isolation was part of the allure. I maneuvered my vehicle into the gravel pull-off shortly after 9:00 a.m. No other vehicles were present. The area was utterly deserted. The trailhead itself was unmarked, merely a decaying wooden post approximately 15 feet back from the road's shoulder, with two corroded bolts protruding like skeletal ribs. Whatever had once been affixed to it had long since vanished. The trail was almost imperceptible, a faint indentation in the dense undergrowth, as if the very earth itself retained its memory more distinctly than the surrounding trees. I donned my pack, re-examined the map, and then stepped into the encompassing woods. From my very first steps, the air felt decidedly wrong. It possessed a stillness, the kind of stillness that isn't immediately apparent but gradually envelops you like a damp shirt. It wasn't hostile, merely unusually quiet. I paused and listened intently. There were no birds, not even the distant familiar hum of insects. At the time, I casually dismissed it, attributing it to the cool morning air or the higher elevation. Perhaps the birds were simply elsewhere. I affixed my initial ribbon approximately a quarter mile into the trail, precisely where it briefly branched around the remnants of an enormous tree stump, roughly 10 feet across. It bore the appearance of having been struck by lightning decades prior, its center blackened and hollowed out like a small cave. I continued my trek. The trail gradually diminished, weaving through dense patches of spruce and rhododendron. There were no discernible boot prints, no discarded refuse, nothing to suggest that anyone had passed through in months, possibly even longer. It was peaceful in a profoundly solitary manner. I systematically marked sharp turns, treacherously slippery rocks, and low-hanging branches. I had traversed approximately 2 miles before I resolved to take a respite. A large flat stone, sufficiently smooth to serve as a seat, lay off to the side of the path. I unburdened myself of my pack, took a restorative sip of water, and reached for my field notebook to jot down some coordinates. That was the precise moment I observed it. An orange ribbon just ahead, meticulously tied to a thin, brittle branch on the uphill side of the trail. It matched the length of the ribbons I was utilizing, possessed the same distinctive double fold, and was secured with an identical knot. Yet I had unequivocally not tied it there. I gazed at it for an extended period. It did not flutter. There was no discernible wind. The branch appeared so desiccated that it audibly cracked beneath my gloved touch. However, the ribbon itself was taut, neatly tied and perfectly clean, exhibiting no fading or fraying, as if it had been affixed that very morning. I began to question my own perception. Had I somehow inadvertently circled back or tied it earlier without conscious realization? I inspected my boots. There were no indications of double tracks. The forest floor consisted primarily of dry pine needles. Nothing overtly evident, but still I felt an internal conviction that if I had indeed circled back, I would have been aware of it. I scrawled a note in my notebook, ribbon unplaced, and resumed my walk. It was at this juncture that the trail commenced its deviation. According to the map, I should have been following a gentle rightward curve along a ridge line, yet the path was subtly descending to the left. It began gradually, imperceptible enough that I did not notice until I consulted the contour lines. It simply did not align. I halted and retrieved my compass, allowing the needle to settle. It wobbled, then floated, taking its time before finally pointing directly south. I should have been headed northwest. I tapped it, shook it vigorously, attempted again. Still, it obstinately pointed south. I felt more irritation than anything else. I disliked feeling disoriented. I pressed onward now with heightened caution. Not 5 minutes later, I spotted a second orange ribbon. This one was affixed to a young birch sapling precisely at the inner edge of a bend. Same color, same style, merely suspended there, still as glass. I touched it. Still dry, still appearing new. I carefully detached it, compared it to my own. There was no discernible difference. I tucked it into my pocket. Approximately 20 minutes subsequent to that, I encountered something that compelled me to halt completely. It was a small stone cairn. 6 rocks were meticulously stacked, 3 at the base, 2 atop those, and then a single flat stone positioned like a lid. It was not haphazardly constructed. Someone had dedicated considerable time to its creation. And wedged deliberately between the top 2 stones like a lever was a dry twig. It hadn't merely been dropped in, It was angled, intentionally secured. I refrained from touching any part of it. I circumambulated it, endeavoring not to disturb anything. Following that discovery, the entire environment felt altered. The trail grew darker, not due to an overcast sky, but from the increasing density of the tree canopy. Light simply failed to penetrate. I glanced at my timepiece. It was nearly noon. It should have been bright. The sky had been clear when I parked my vehicle. Now everything appeared desaturated, not truly dark, but utterly colorless. Then came the ribbons. At first there was one, then two more spaced 10 paces apart. Subsequently, a profusion of them, 4 or 5, were tied all over a single tree like decorative ornaments. They remained motionless at first, but as I stood there observing, they began to sway. There was no wind, no discernible breeze, nothing else stirred. And abruptly I became acutely aware of the silence once more, but this time it felt profoundly wrong. It was a complete silence. There was no rustling of wind in the branches, no distant chirps of birds, no rustling of leaves. It was a dead silence, the kind that feels oppressively heavy in one's ears, as if you have inadvertently stepped into a hermetically sealed chamber. I turned around. The path behind me was incorrect. It appeared too clean, too smooth. There were no disturbed leaves, no broken twigs, and none of the ribbons I had meticulously tied. I searched for my boot marks. Nothing. I checked my compass. The needle twitched once, then floated and pointed directly behind me. So I dutifully followed it. After what seemed like 10 agonizing minutes of walking, I came upon the very same cairn. Only this time, the twig was conspicuously absent. I did not pause. I continued moving. This time, I deliberately dragged the side of my boot along the trunks of trees as I passed, scraping off bark purely to assert my presence, to leave some discernible mark. But each time I risked a glance backward, the trail appeared utterly untouched. And then I heard it, a sharp crack resembling a thick branch fracturing under immense strain originating from behind me. I did not turn. Another crack, closer this time. Then absolute nothingness. But it no longer felt like mere silence. It felt as though the very woods were actively waiting. I accelerated to a jog, still no full-blown panic, merely an overwhelming sense of urgency. Then at last, I perceived the gap in the trees, the trailhead. But something was amiss. The familiar wooden post had split. A long diagonal crack bifurcated it, as if struck by lightning. The two halves remained anchored in the ground but tilted away from each other, as if they had been forcibly pried apart. I walked directly past them, emerging back into the full daylight. The world outside appeared normal once again, bright, warm. A pair of hikers were leisurely unloading their gear from a Terra cruiser further down the road. Birds chirped nearby. I uttered not a single word to them. I simply entered my truck and drove away. That night, sleep proved elusive and difficult. Every time I closed my eyes, I vividly saw the orange ribbons. I heard that chilling crack again. I felt the oppressive weight of that silent forest pressing in around me. I attempted to rationalize it, telling myself I had made a mistake. Perhaps the trail formed a loop and I had simply failed to realize it. Perhaps the compass had malfunctioned due to unusual mineral deposits or changes in elevation. Perhaps there was a logical explanation for everything. But my thoughts persistently returned to how the path had not aligned with the map, and how the wooden post was conspicuously split when I re-emerged. The following morning, I contacted the sector coordinator and inquired if anyone else had recently gone up that trail. He responded negatively. That specific trail had not been assigned to anyone in over 2 years. The last individual who logged it had marked it as temporarily inaccessible due to significant terrain changes. No one had returned since. I did not return, not immediately. But after a week, I found myself unable to dismiss the unsettling experience. I drove back out, this time accompanied by a friend, Luca, another volunteer. I brought the identical map and the same gear. We pulled into the precise same gravel turnout, only to discover there was no post, no trail. We meticulously searched up and down the road for almost half an hour, examining every bend, every potential marker. The ridgelines simply did not align. Nothing appeared the same. Story 3. I was 18 years old when I enrolled in this weekend trail restoration initiative, administered by the National Wilderness Conservancy. They had christened it the Conservation Youth Corps, a designation that frankly made it sound far more appealing than its actual reality. Primarily, it served as a convenient pretext to enlist teenagers to haul dense brush and excavate drainage ditches in exchange for valuable volunteer hours and a coveted line on a college application. There were 5 of us in total, all hailing from nearby towns. I hadn't truly acquainted myself with anyone prior to the inaugural day, but we managed to get along reasonably well. Nothing dramatic transpired, just the characteristic polite, slightly awkward camaraderie that often emerges when a group of unfamiliar individuals is thrust into a wilderness setting and expected to collaborate. Our supervision was entrusted to a ranger named Guardian Maeve. She was in her mid-30s, a quiet but demonstrably competent individual, the type of person who consistently maintained an unruffled demeanor even when circumstances unequivocally warranted a state of agitation. The 3rd day marked the point when events began to subtly shift. We were scheduled to traverse an antiquated fire road that had been deliberately closed off for several decades. Guardian Maeve explained that it had once provided access to a ridge where a fire watchtower had been established back in the 1950s, but the dense forest had largely reclaimed its former route. The trail itself was absent from any contemporary maps, which imbued our journey with the distinct sensation of venturing into some forgotten, secluded corner of the state. The further we hiked, the more peculiar the landscape became. The path gradually began to dissipate into soft moss and low-lying ferns, almost as if it were being systematically swallowed by the surrounding flora. After a while, we ceased walking in a linear formation and instead drifted somewhat aimlessly in pairs, meticulously inspecting for loose stones, broken boards, or anything that could potentially impede a future hiker. That was the precise moment we spotted it. The cabin materialized into view so abruptly that I genuinely believed I was initially hallucinating. It bore the unmistakable appearance of being completely abandoned, and yet, paradoxically, it did not exhibit the expected state of ruin. The roof had noticeably buckled inward, one corner sagging dramatically like a collapsed lung. The wooden siding was bleached to a pale gray, a consequence of years of relentless sun exposure and persistent damp air. Ivy had comprehensively overtaken the majority of one wall, and the porch steps were half submerged by the encroaching ground. A mailbox, an old-fashioned metal variety, was affixed to the side, angled awkwardly and corroded through in various places. Guardian Maeve immediately ceased walking. She blinked at the cabin as if it had simply manifested out of thin air. "That's not supposed to be here," she muttered, appearing genuinely perplexed for the very first time since our initial encounter with her. We inquired if it might be a remnant of an old station or some other structure, but she merely shook her head. "It's not on any of the survey logs," she asserted. We were not scheduled to return to camp for another couple of hours, so Guardian Maeve decided we would take a break there while she hiked back to retrieve a toolkit we had inadvertently left behind at the last clearing. She stated she would only be absent for 15 minutes, instructing us to remain there and explicitly not to enter the structure. She had not even been gone for a full minute when June discovered the envelope. She had wandered to the side of the cabin and called out for us to come examine it. The mailbox was curiously intact, given the dilapidated condition of everything else. Inside, completely dry, was a yellowed envelope, sealed with a peculiar thick wax, as if it had been dripped from a candle that had never fully cooled. The name Maris was inscribed across the front in a shaky, almost overly elegant handwriting, slanted and somewhat chaotic. June passed it to me. I held it without conscious thought. It felt remarkably lighter than it should have, as though the paper within had hollowed itself out. We did not immediately open it. We simply stood there, passing it amongst ourselves and exchanging foolish jokes about ancient moonshine shacks and ghostly mail. However, the moment I stepped inside the cabin, every fiber of my being tensed. It did not emit the expected odor of decay, which would have been logical. Instead, it smelled distinctly of metal, like hot arcing wires or scorched dust emanating from an old toaster. The floorboards groaned audibly beneath our collective weight. But it wasn't merely the sound, it was the patterns that completely unnerved me. Footprints imprinted in the dust led directly across the room and then abruptly terminated in corners where absolutely nothing resided. The dust itself appeared to be deliberately arranged, almost as if someone had meticulously brushed shapes into it and then half erased them. A broken chair was positioned precisely in the dead center of the room, facing the wall, as if it had been placed there with specific intent. A cot nestled in the corner sagged in a manner that strongly suggested someone had folded themselves into it and never quite uncurled. None of it made any coherent sense. At the farthest end of the room stood a cast-iron wood stove blackened with rust. I cautiously opened it merely to ascertain if anything had been incinerated within. Inside was another envelope, identical wax seal. The same word, Maris. I did not open either of them. I clandestinely stuffed them into the very bottom of my bag, zipped it securely, and maintained my silence. Guardian Maeve returned a few minutes later, and we proceeded onward. That night, after the cabin's lights were extinguished, I sat on the edge of my cot, a flashlight concealed beneath my sleeping bag, and carefully opened the second envelope, the one I had retrieved from the stove. It contained a single line, neatly printed in the middle of the page. "Don't let it whisper through your words." That was all. No signature, no date, no discernible clue as to its meaning. The subsequent morning, I revealed it to the group. Everyone laughed. It was easy to laugh in the full light of day. Someone remarked that it sounded like the kind of eerie poetry a friend might compose after enrolling in community college and becoming enamored with crystals. We continued to mock it until the underlying unease gradually dissipated. Then we resumed our work. Guardian Maeve led us in the direction of a drainage cut that had been flagged near Slate Ridge. I distinctly recall the first hour because I was diligently chewing sunflower seeds and attempting to synchronize my steps with my breathing to prevent overheating. Then I spotted the tree, a grotesquely twisted oak, its roots pulling it sideways as if it were a rope coiled too tightly. I had marked it the previous day with a red flag. We were nowhere near our intended location. Guardian Maeve once again looked bewildered. She retrieved her compass and stared intently at it. The needle was spinning slowly as if searching for a signal. Then it abruptly stopped and pointed directly south, a completely erroneous direction. No one in the group quite knew what to articulate. Then the cabin reappeared. The same clearing, the same sagging porch, the same crooked mailbox. Guardian Maeve remained silent. She simply instructed us to take a break. I distanced myself from the group, stepping back toward the tree line, hoping I might ascertain how we had seemingly looped back without conscious realization. That was when I heard it. "Hey, I'm over here." My own voice possessing the identical tone, the same cadence, not close enough to touch, but not far either. I froze. I did not respond, I merely listened intently. The sound emanated from directly behind the cabin. I instinctively sprinted back to the group, my heart violently hammering in my chest. June was staring directly behind me. "You were just there," she stated, gesturing. "No," I gasped, already breathless. "I wasn't. I was by the trees." She frowned. "Your shirt? It was red." Mine was green, faded with sweat. There was no possibility of mistaking it. Neither of us spoke much after that. I pulled Guardian Maeve aside and recounted everything. She did not laugh. She didn't even appear surprised. She merely checked the batteries in her radio. We attempted to depart again, selecting a different trail, walking with hurried strides and intense focus. But every turn inexplicably circled us back, as if we were trapped on an endless loop. The cabin door abruptly slammed shut behind us without any warning. No one had touched it. We turned. It creaked back open just a fraction. Guardian Maeve raised her radio. Static exploded from it, loud and raw. Then my voice again. "Maris, it's okay, come inside." She dropped the radio. Not a single word was uttered by anyone. We left. We walked without speaking, Guardian Maeve now leading by pure instinct. Her jaw was clenched tightly. I could observe her hand clenching and unclenching the strap of her bag. Then we heard the footsteps behind us. Fast, as if someone was attempting to keep pace. Subsequently, a rasping version of my voice, dry and cracked. "Wait, please." I met June's gaze. She mouthed it this time. "Don't look back." So I did not. None of us did, but we distinctly heard it moving through the trees above us. At one point, it was directly overhead amidst the branches. Then a second voice joined, deeper, slower. "You already did. You already let me." I remembered the unopened envelope, still securely zipped in my bag. Without conscious thought, I flung the entire bag off the trail, kicking it deep into the underbrush. We did not cease our flight. 20 minutes later, the trees parted. We stepped out onto gravel, real gravel, the outpost shelter. Guardian Maeve's truck was parked there, appearing as if it had never moved. We quickly climbed in. No one dared to look back. That night, after I had returned home, I unzipped my coat pocket. There it was, the second envelope. I hadn't retrieved it yet, it was there regardless. I attempted to burn it in the kitchen sink. It utterly refused to ignite. It merely smoked for 20 minutes before a corner finally curled. Story 4. That particular summer, my uncle permitted me to reside at his antiquated cabin situated high near Spruce Hollow, tucked into the upper fringes of the Cerulean Mountain Passage. My uncle had recently suffered a torn rotator cuff while performing forest path teamwork, likely from clearing deadfall or hauling something excessively heavy, and required someone to oversee the property during his recovery. The duties were nothing overly strenuous, primarily clearing some overgrowth, replacing damaged trail signs, and ensuring that no unauthorized individuals were squatting within the dense woods, that sort of mundane task. I had just recently graduated from college. No employment was secured, and I harbored no concrete plans beyond leisurely drifting through the summer months and perhaps discovering a modicum of self-understanding. The prospect of a few weeks devoid of human interaction, free from incessant noise and unburdened by the constant buzzing of a phone every 5 minutes, honestly sounded utterly idyllic. The cabin was remotely located, and by remote I mean genuinely remote. The final turnoff comprised a gravel switchback road that wound upward, seemingly endlessly, replete with potholes deep enough to disrupt one's vehicle alignment merely by looking at them. I was compelled to make a stop at a quaint establishment named Hank's Provisions, and anglers stopped to replenish my fuel and meticulously double-check my spare tire. Once you traversed past the rusted-out mile marker and your mobile signal invariably vanished. That was it. It was simply you and the encompassing forest. Initially, I found myself quite enamored with it. I would awaken to absolute silence. No engines roaring, no human voices, just profound stillness. I would hike along the ridgeline, inspecting for posted signs that had succumbed to the wind, and meticulously swapping out any broken trail markers. On some days, I wouldn't encounter a single human being. I would prepare my meals over the propane burner, delve into whatever battered paperbacks I discovered in the storage bins, and meticulously jot down a to-do list each morning. The list typically included repairs such as porch boards that rebounded unreliably when stepped upon incorrectly, the water pump that emitted a piercing squeal before finally engaging, and a screen door that never fully latched unless yanked with precise force. These minor tasks provided me with a comforting rhythm. They kept my hands busily engaged and my mind placid. The first instance that something felt amiss occurred on a Wednesday. I recall this specifically because I had just concluded a long haul to the northern junction to replace a trail sign, the very one situated at that peculiar fork near the dried creek bed. The antiquated post had been cleanly snapped through. Not rotted or weathered, simply broken, as if something exceptionally heavy or someone filled with intense anger had caused its demise. I attributed it to a fallen tree branch or perhaps an overly zealous hiker armed with too much leisure time and a hatchet. It didn't genuinely disturb me then. Not yet. I returned in the late afternoon, my boots caked with mud, my shoulders aching. I kicked them off at the door, sank into the recliner with a book, and was halfway between reading and drifting into slumber when I heard it. A single creak. Not loud, not dramatic, merely sufficient to fracture the pervading silence. It emanated from the floorboards adjacent to the kitchen. Initially, I surmised that perhaps a mouse had squeezed between the boards, or it was simply the cabin settling. Old wooden structures often do that. But something about that sound compelled me to sit upright. I stared intently toward the kitchen. Nothing stirred. The light streaming from the window stretched long across the counter, casting a faded yellow hue upon everything. Nothing appeared overtly different, yet it felt as though the air had somehow thickened, as if the room was no longer empty, even though it still visually appeared so. I rose, then meticulously traversed the entire cabin. It did not require much time. There was only the main room containing the recliner and kitchen, a short hallway featuring 2 doors, one leading to the bedroom where I slept, and the other accessing the gear room and the bathroom tucked away at the rear. I verified every window. All were securely locked. Both doors were bolted. Everything was ostensibly normal, yet I found myself unable to relax. I activated the shortwave radio and permitted the static to permeate the room. I appreciated the background noise. It rendered the silence less suffocating. Typically, I would catch fragments of weather chatter or someone making a call from a fire tower. That night, however, it was solely static. Garbled whispers that intermittently broke through, yet nothing I could decipher. I had no appetite for dinner, but I compelled myself to consume a can of chili simply to provide myself with a task to perform. I washed the pan, stored it away, and rearranged a few items in the cabinet that required no attention whatsoever. I was desperately seeking anything that felt remotely normal. By the time night fully settled, I was utterly wired. I couldn't read and I couldn't remain still. Every creak emanating from the rafters sounded like something lurking, waiting. Eventually, I ascended into bed and stared fixedly at the ceiling until sleep finally overtook me. When I awoke, it was precisely 2:47 a.m., not due to a dream nor a need to use the restroom, but because I had distinctly heard another creak. This time, it originated from the hallway. I did not immediately move, merely lay there, breathing slowly, endeavoring to hear beyond the thunderous pounding in my chest. It wasn't a loud sound, just a subtle shift in weight, as if someone had minutely shifted their foot. I carefully slid out of bed and padded softly to the door, pressing my ear against its surface. Nothing. I opened it. The hallway appeared identical except for the window positioned above the kitchen sink, which was conspicuously open. And by open, I mean pushed out entirely, as if someone had cranked it until it clicked into its furthest position and then left it there. I had not touched that window, not once, and it was not the type of window that opened on its own. One had to exert considerable force to open it, hearing it groan in protest. I stepped into the kitchen slowly and peered outside. There was only the black expanse of trees and a faint glimmer of moonlight. No movement, no sound. But I knew with absolute certainty that window had not been open. I closed it, locked it securely, and stood perfectly still. Then breathing, soft, shallow, came from the gear room. I didn't even think. I didn't call out or attempt to frighten it away. I turned slowly and walked directly to the front door. The deadbolt was jammed, not locked incorrectly, not simply stuck, but truly jammed. I jiggled the doorknob, twisted the bolt with greater force. It groaned but remained unyielding, and behind me, just behind, came a sound. Not a footstep, not a voice, just a bearish shuffle, like weight subtly shifting from one foot to another. I slammed my shoulder into the door with all my might. The bolt finally gave way. I yanked it open and sprinted barefoot down the gravel path, utterly indifferent to the possibility of cutting my feet open. I did not cease running until I reached the outpost shelter situated at the bottom of the trail system. The rangers were visibly surprised to encounter me at 4 a.m., wild-eyed and barefoot. They promptly offered me a blanket, asked a few perfunctory questions, and then dispatched a couple of their men to inspect the cabin. They were absent for over an hour. When they returned, they spoke little, merely confirming that no one was present save for the fact that the gear room door had been propped open with a piece of bark beneath its hinge. And inside there were muddy footprints, bare feet, not my own, but larger. The prints led in 2 distinct directions, one towards the recliner and another towards the kitchen window. They terminated abruptly behind the chair. There were no prints leading away, no smudges on the floor, just a set of feet that had seemingly walked in and never walked out. My uncle sold the property that autumn. He casually informed me he was too old for that kind of living. I never disclosed to him the true reason I had departed. Story 5. I hail from a modest locality just outside of Roanoke. Nothing particularly extraordinary. Last autumn, I secured a seasonal employment with the Woodland Stewardship Division performing trail maintenance. This was quintessential grunt work. The specific stretch of trail I was assigned didn't even possess a proper designation, merely a 12-mile loop buried somewhere between mile 70 and 80 on the Greater Appalachian Pathway. It was an endless expanse of trees, mud, rocks, and more trees. It felt like a segment of the trail that time itself had completely forgotten. And that, in a way, was precisely why I enjoyed it. After spending 2 years folding cardboard and dismantling pallets in a warehouse that perpetually reeked of plastic and perspiration, stepping into a forest each morning felt akin to winning the lottery. I was spared from having to interact with people. No tiresome co-workers, no obligatory small talk, no rigid clocking in or out, just myself, my equipment, and a radio that only chirped to life once a day for mandatory check-ins. The job itself was remarkably simple. Clear fallen branches, repair trail edging, refresh faded markers, and report anything unusual. They provided me with a field radio, a topographic map, and a GPS tracker that emitted a signal once every hour. This wasn't for navigation, but merely to provide irrefutable proof that I hadn't succumbed to a ravine. For the initial 3 weeks, it proved to be precisely what I required: quiet, predictable. I became intimately acquainted with that stretch of trail, more so than my own apartment. I began to recognize the subtle nuances, the particular knot in a tree trunk that resembled a face, a specific log that invariably hosted 3 squabbling squirrels, a peculiar split in a pine trunk that evoked the image of a wishbone. These small individual markers evolved into my personal map. I could precisely determine my location on the loop simply by observing the appearance of the terrain. There was a large boulder, distinctly shaped like a fishhook, that always signaled I was precisely halfway through. Immediately preceding that landmark, I would consistently pass a metal boundary marker, a white post perhaps 3 feet tall with a number meticulously stamped into its base. I didn't dwell on it much. It was merely a fixed feature, as if the trail possessed teeth, and that marker was one of them. Then one day it was conspicuously gone. I didn't immediately register its absence. I passed the boulder, continued walking, then after a few minutes realized that the trail felt inherently wrong. The incline was off. The undergrowth appeared excessively dense. I stopped and retrieved my GPS device, which I almost never utilized. I had traveled further than my usual distance, not by a significant margin, perhaps a quarter mile, but enough to compel me to halt. I slowly retraced my steps, meticulously scanning the trees, the dirt, searching for that missing marker. When I arrived at the exact spot, there was merely a shallow hole in the earth. Not even a deep cavity, just a pocket in the ground, perhaps the size of a large coffee can. The surrounding dirt appeared freshly disturbed, clumpy, as if something had forcibly yanked the post straight out. I radioed it in, informing the office of my discovery. They instructed me to mark it and proceed. So I flagged a nearby branch with orange tape, made a corresponding note on my paper map, and continued walking. That night I dreamt I was hiking the loop again. In the dream, everything appeared normal until I stepped down onto something hard beneath the dirt. It shifted beneath my boot ever so slightly, as if it were loose. When I bent down to brush away the soil, I perceived the top of a white metal post protruding, rocking gently from side to side like a loose tooth. The following morning I hiked out again. The same stretch of trail, the same tools, the same path. And there it was. The post was back. Not merely replaced, it was the identical one. The same scratch near the base, the same rust streak on its side, the same subtle tilt. But the ground surrounding it was perfectly smooth. There was no indication it had ever been moved. No disturbed soil, no flags, just undeniably present. I stared at it for a prolonged period, likely longer than I should have. Eventually, I resumed walking and attempted to convince myself that I must have simply missed it the day before. Gotten turned around. It was considerably easier to believe that than to accept the unsettling alternative. Then I began to lose time. It commenced subtly with small, imperceptible slips. I would estimate the time was around 3 p.m., check my watch and discover it was well past 5 p.m. That sort of inexplicable discrepancy. I initially attributed it to the dense tree cover. Beneath the canopy, light did not shift in the conventional manner. One could spend hours without the sun breaking through. But it steadily worsened. One afternoon, I checked in on the radio. I was convinced it was 4:15 p.m. The dispatcher responded with an annoyed tone stating it was 6:42 p.m. I scrutinized my watch again. It still displayed 4:15 p.m. I replaced the battery that night. No difference. So I retrieved a backup, an old wind-up watch my father had gifted me years prior. No batteries, just gears. That one lost time too. Not as rapidly, but enough to be concerning. Then came the night I departed the trail, believing it was perhaps 6 p.m. I stepped out of the woods into absolute pitch blackness. Full stars glittered in the sky, with no lingering twilight. It was as if I had inexplicably skipped forward in time. Following that, the trail itself began to feel different. Parts of it seemed to shift. Familiar landmarks moved. One day I rounded a bend and discovered the fishhook boulder on the wrong side of the path, At first, I speculated that I had somehow looped around. Perhaps I had taken an incorrect turn. But when I attempted to backtrack, the trail behind me was gone, entirely swallowed by thick brush. I spent 2 exhaustive hours bushwhacking in circles, simply striving to relocate the gravel access road. I do not know how far I walked. I only know that I uttered not a single word of it upon my return to the outpost shelter. I did not want it formally recorded. Then, the voice commenced. Initially, it was merely strange repetitions. I would murmur something like, "Careful there," or "Watch it," under my breath. Then a few seconds later, I would hear it again. The same words, the identical rhythm, but notably quieter and always from behind me, as if someone was diligently following just out of sight. I attempted to deceive it. I spoke nonsensical words aloud. Green sock, banana, 7 deer bottles. Nothing reverberated back. But if I articulated anything coherent and real, it would echo it. Delayed, subtly off-pitch, as if the words were struggling to emerge from a throat too constricted. I ceased speaking entirely. That, however, did not deter it. One afternoon, I slipped on loose gravel and landed forcefully. In my mind, not vocally, I thought, "This place hates me." And clear as anything, from somewhere behind a nearby tree, I heard, "Hates me." That was the pivotal day I abandoned everything and ran. Not towards the access road, not towards my car, but simply away. I didn't even comprehend what I was fleeing from. I never visually perceived anything, yet I undeniably felt it. Like someone walking exactly 1 step behind me, perfectly matching my pace. Then came the breathing. Not loud or raspy, merely a steady human respiration following my every move. It remained with me even when I stopped. Especially when I stopped. I believe I blacked out for a portion of the experience. One moment I was running. The next I was at the gravel lot, my hands trembling so violently that I fumbled my keys. I do not recall opening the car door. Only the instant I slammed it shut and locked the doors. Then everything went silent, completely, as if the very sound had been vacuumed out of the world. I never returned. I didn't even collect my final paycheck. I didn't return the issued gear. I ignored every single call from the sector coordinator. I allowed the entire matter to remain unresolved until the number ceased appearing on my phone. A few weeks later, I yielded to my persistent curiosity and conducted some online research. I searched for that specific section of the trail. Nothing recent surfaced. No accidents, no missing hikers, no reports of peculiar occurrences. But I did discover a scanned copy of an old newspaper article from 1963. A solo hiker had been discovered deceased out there. The article stated he was barefoot, his feet severely shredded from running, found curled up beneath a tree with a look of pure horror frozen on his face. The coroner officially declared that he had died of shock. He was found clutching a metal trail marker in both hands, and no one ever definitively determined how he had managed to pull it out of the ground. By